Thank you very much, Keith. As many of you know, inducting me in the Automotive Hall of Fame is not an autonomous process, to use a current phrase. And there's some people who were very responsible for it, and I'm very appreciative. And of course, Keith being very in the forefront of that. I thought some of you would like to know why I think I'm a proxy here in receiving this award from the Automotive Hall of Fame and a board of directors. Because it's important to see how something happens in sequence. And when I went to the World's Fair of 1939, I was 5 years old. And I remember our family walking down a very wide area heading toward the GM Futurama. It's a huge building. It was a symbol of the 39 World's Fair. And I was so excited. I ran ahead of my parents shouting, "GM, GM, GM." Little did they know. The sequence, however, was to be more tragic. I lost a lot of friends in high school and college, and those who survived were quadriplegics, and they didn't survive long in those days, and paraplegics. I was very motivated by the loss of my friends, but in those days it was all the driver's fault, what some people in the industry called the nut behind the wheel. But I did a lot of hitchhiking. I literally hitchhiked tens and tens of thousands of miles all over the country and back and forth to Princeton and Harvard. Sometimes we were first at a scene of the crash before the emergency vehicles. And it was just like mind-blowing to me. Shredded flesh, screams, fires, limbs torn apart. You know, you can see pictures of it, and you can see cars being crashed into fixed barriers, but until you really see it on the highway, it's total mayhem. And I got curious, and there were times when I would look at cars that were crashed, photographs, and I would see the steering column come back right into the driver. And I would see people spilled out on the road. And I got curious because that didn't happen usually in auto racing. In auto racing, they had seat belts, they had roll bars, they had all kinds of protections that we now call crash worthiness protections. And they survived incredible crashes. And all this started percolating until I went to Harvard Law School and I did a third-year paper on unsafe automotive design and legal liability, because I looked at the law as a mechanism to manage violence. I realized that at the law school there was nothing on unsafe cars and bad highways. The cases all revolved around driver-to-driver combat. Who was negligent, who was not negligent, who's going to win, who's going to lose. And there's no, what we say, there's no human factors engineering being the subject of the legal discussion here and allocating responsibilities. And then I met a retired engineer from American Motors Corporation. His name was Henry Wakeland. And in my long conversations with him, he told me about the enormous self-censorship inside the industry. And I'd say, this can't be so. I mean, you mean they don't speak up, even in closed doors among themselves? He says, they're all afraid. I said, afraid of what? Afraid of being marked as troublemakers, non-players on the team. And he gave me a lot of examples. At the same time, I was reading ads by General Motors boasting that they had 21,000 scientists and engineers. Well, what were they doing other than production engineering? Were they engaged in innovation for better brakes, tires, better crash worthiness? These were the days when our brakes and tires were way beyond the auto companies in Western Europe. The auto company executives were not really interested in supporting research in crashworthiness at MIT and Caltech and Wayne State and elsewhere. They were interested in teaching graduate engineers what GM once called the industry way. Well, then came the legislation. The legislation would not have passed without half a dozen reporters and Helen Kahn of Automotive News. It's not enough just to put the facts on the table if nobody were aware of them. And so we had Bob Irvin of the Detroit News, one of the great heroes in my book. We had Walter Rugaber of the New York Times Detroit Bureau. We had Norm Miller of the Wall Street Journal in Detroit. We had Pat Sloyan, a future Pulitzer Prize winner of UPI, and Morton Mintz of the Washington Post. And they followed the story as it wound through the Congress and to Lyndon Johnson's desk. And all the byplay that was part of it was pretty dramatic at that time. All in all, it taught me an interesting lesson, is that major changes are made in American history with very few people having the facts, having stamina, and representing perhaps a very quiet majority opinion. That was the formula Abraham Lincoln gave us. He said, with public sentiment behind you, you can do anything. But without the media reaching that public to inform that public sentiment, it wouldn't have happened. But there's a long way to go. The suppliers are the spark plug of innovation. They confront the not invented here syndrome over the years by the manufacturers. The bureaucracies of the manufacturers are their principal enemy to protecting life, limb on the highways. Bureaucracy, wherever it is, government, business, unions, has commonalities to them. They suppress conscience. They retaliate against moral courage. They inhibit ideas. They require obedience. They reward stagnation and elevate it, as long as the profits come in. Today's problems are not yesterday's problems with the auto industry. They represent excessive complexity and turning the motor vehicle into a supercomputer on wheels, increasingly furnished for entertainment and office work purposes, distracted driving. And more, the driver is losing control of the vehicle. That's what software does. And more, the vulnerabilities of hacking and of corporate criminality, like VW, that was a premeditated crime involving, the newspapers increasingly tell us, more and more people inside VW over a period of years, going up the ranks. Many people in General Motors knew about the vehicle defect, the vehicle switch defect. And more people knew about Takata, going up the line. We've ceased just to see carelessness, ignorance, and indifference. These are increasingly criminal acts, not prosecuted because there's no criminal penalty in the motor vehicle safety law. The corporate lobbyists got that excised in 1966. And so I appeal to all of you here and your colleagues to think of a broader spectrum of values that motor vehicles need to serve. I did benefit from people in the industry who competed. When Volvo put three-point seatbelts in the 1950s, and I heard the auto companies here say three-point seatbelts would be very bad for internal injury and sudden deceleration, I asked them to demonstrate the difference between the anatomy of the American people and the Swedish people. Somehow it worked pretty well for them. Some of the defenses against greater auto safety verged on tragic hilarity. There was Howard Gandela, who was in charge of safety for General Motors, who told people that he would advise parents anticipating a sudden collision to immediately order their children to put their hands on the dash panel, to brace themselves, apparently not knowing that you could be the most powerful boxer in the world and you couldn't brace yourself against a 15-mile-an-hour collision. So many things can be done so simply. The airbag was used in World War I pilots to keep them from, not the airbag, the seatbelt, to keep them from falling out of the plane in 1916. The padded dash panel was used by ancient Roman chariots. That's a lot of lead time for the auto companies. We had situations where I would confront the arguments of the auto companies with total incredulity. But I knew better because I had a lot of contacts inside the auto companies. I'd come to Detroit Airport, we'd get into a cab, and we'd go all around the airport while they were feeding me information and leaving me with materials in plain envelopes. These were patriots. They were not willing to risk their jobs and their career, but they felt a professional obligation to convey the obvious, which is unleash the engineers, and you won't believe what can happen, and how fast it can happen, and how economical it can happen, and how their teachings can move engineering integrity to a higher level and subordinate stylistic pornography and excessive horsepower of those days. The auto industry needs to recognize that it is only one form of surface transportation. And with all the attention to autonomous vehicles, which none of us here will ever see on the norm in the highways, for all the reasons Google is starting to admit, they're up to 30 years now in terms of timetable. There's not much attention to modern mass transit and public transit and the great engineering innovations that can revolutionize those forms of driverless vehicles, at least for most of the people in them. And we have to start paying attention to these necessities for our own efficiency as a society and for the economic health of our planet. I want to thank Bill Chapin particularly. I don't know how much heat he took for this, but to me, it shouldn't be controversial at all. You should always have consumer and environmental advocates who really risked a lot and sweated a lot and achieved a lot as part of your awards, along with your own engineers and management specialists. I often wondered how you all were able to solve such incredibly complex problems of putting these vehicles together and merchandising them, and neglected to solve the simplest safety problems like putting a seatbelt in a car. Doing all that we do inside the industry and outside to make motor vehicles more benign, more kind, more efficient, allowing people to be more productive, to use their time more usefully, to save space for public and modern mass transit. All these people are almost never given the award that you've given me this evening, which is why I'm very pleased to accept it in that manner. Thank you all.